right, good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Buying or Selling a Business, Offers, Contracts, and Closing. We have Don Hobbs with us here from Front Range Business. Please put any questions that you have in the chat, or you can wait until the end during Q&A to ask those. You will be receiving a recording of this webinar, and the presentation can be found in your client dashboard. I'll also drop that in the chat for you if you want to follow along there as well. You will be receiving a bunch of information and links, including the presentation and the recording after this webinar, so keep an eye out for that. And thank you. I hope you enjoy the webinar. I will hand it over to Don.
Thank you very much. Always great to be here. We really appreciate the Larimer Small Business Development Center and your activities to help educate buyers and sellers of business. My name is Don Hobbs. I am a broker with Front Range Business based out of Boulder, but as you can see on the screen, we also have offices up in the mountains, Evergreen, Fort Collins, and really around the Denver metro area are our team of about 15 or 16 brokers. I have lived along the Front Range for over 50 years. I'm a graduate of the University of Colorado. I know you're big fans up in Fort Collins of CSU, but I went to school down here. I've been a broker for 8 years, following different careers in corporate America, and also the ownership of 3 of my own businesses, which I started. I didn't buy them, but I started them and sold them all. So as I came into this broker world, I had a little bit of exposure to that, and really do enjoy what we do and the benefits we attempt to bring to sellers who are looking to move on from their business and buyers who are looking to get into business. So what I'm going to do now is just move ahead to kind of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So one of the things I always like to point out is, this is a distillation of the years of experience that I've gained, and also a lot of this comes from my fellow brokers who've helped put the content together. So we can't teach you how to sell a business, even the limited part we're talking about today, in a 90-minute seminar. It's not a how-to, it's going to be a detailed introduction. These are the kinds of things you should be aware of. And then as you get closer to buying or selling a business, obviously, you'll have to get more detailed with that. It's also the case that no 2 transactions are going to be exactly the same. There are going to be variables, things that happen within a given transaction that are unique to that transaction. But in many cases, there's very common elements. And certainly what we're going to cover today, the offer, letter of intent, the contract to purchase, and ultimately the closing, those are going to be a part of just about every transaction that happens. We do welcome your questions. Use the chat feature, and we'll try and take those questions up as we go along. And we certainly encourage you as well to contact us after the program. We are always available to hear what questions you've had and try to answer them for you, again, in support of our work with Larimer SBDC. So that's kind of the overview. Now, as you can see on the slide here, all business sales have 9 steps. You can also say all business purchases have 9 steps, because there's a buyer and there's a seller side. And we've sort of identified these. We actually have another program. It's called the 9 Stages of Buying and Selling a Business, which we run through Larimer SBDC. We did it in June of this year. We'll do it again next year. But these 9 steps really take buyers and sellers through from the very beginning. In that bottom step there, that initial exploration, that's the time when a buyer is going, do I want to purchase a business? What kind of business do I want to purchase? What geography do I want that business to be in? How expensive of a business can I buy? What are my skill sets? So there's exploration on the buyer side, on the seller side. There's the exploration of, am I really ready to sell a business? Sellers typically only offer their business for sale when something in their life has changed. We go into more of that when we're doing the 9-step program, but it's really important. A seller who has a business that's running well and the health is good of the seller owner and the market is good, that business is typically not going to be sold. It's going to be sold when something is changing. Maybe the spouse is being relocated to another state, and to stay together, they got to sell the business and move on. Could be something unfortunate, a disease, illness, or even a death could cause that. But there's something that's changed, and then you move up through these 9 steps. You make your decisions. You get the business listed out there in the market. Buyers are looking at it. They come in, they capture a set of information during the initial due diligence period where they can take a look at the business, maybe not in deep detail, but enough that they know, hey, this is or is not the kind of business I'm genuinely interested in. If they are, they're going to make an offer. That offer will probably be negotiated between buyer and seller, but it'll be refined a little bit. They'll go on, they'll do more due diligence. They'll do that to really get under the hood and make sure they understand exactly what they're getting into. What are the risks associated with this? What are the potential stumbling blocks to put the deal together? And then they'll enter into a purchase agreement. That purchase agreement, as you'll see, is going to be kind of the rules of engagement. That's going to be the document that drives everything through to closing, which is the point that the buyer acquires the business, the seller steps away. There are some post-closing steps often in terms of transition and training, maybe the carrying of a seller note. But every business sale is going to go through these 9 steps. 3 of those steps are contractual or legal steps where there are documents and paperwork and things that have to be structured very specifically for the transaction to happen properly. And that's what we're going to focus on today. We're not going to get into marketing it. We're not going to get into necessarily what the due diligence activities are, but we are going to get into how to make offers, how a contract gets put together, and what happens at closing. All very, very important parts. And because we're only tackling 3 in today's 90-minute program, we're going to be able to get a little more detailed than we would be when we're looking at the overall 9-step program. So without further ado, let's just step forward with the first stage, which is getting offers. So rather than just jump right into the offer itself, let's think about the scenario. What's going on here from a buyer perspective? They've looked at a business. They're trying to prepare to make the offer. What actually has to happen? Well, the buyer needs to know what they're prepared to do. And they need to be prepared to prove that to the seller. I always tell buyers, yes, you're coming with money. Yes, you're planning to purchase this, but buyers should never feel entitled, like the seller should be taking care of them just because they're coming to make an offer. It is every bit the responsibility of the buyer to prove themselves to the seller, just as it's the seller's responsibility to demonstrate what the business is all about. And so if you want a seller to take the offer seriously, Buyers need to know, yes, I have enough money to do it. Yes, I have the skill set to run this type of business. Yes, I can operate in that geography, which might include having to sell your home and relocate to another area. So there's a lot of things to think about. So that's part of that good fit, right? Understanding the geography. I sold a business recently up in the mountains. The person had to buy a home in a very expensive ski resort community. And, their home down along the Front Range was not worth as much as the home there. They needed extra resources just to make that transition of home ownership. Also, family circumstances. A business that's going to take 60 hours a week and be really dynamic and have a lot going on for an owner may not be a very good one if your family circumstances are 4 young children that have to get to school and things going on in the house. You need to be thinking about that. Also, industry cycles. Some businesses, such as construction, are in very cyclical industries. They can be profitable. They can be very successful ownership businesses. But, there are times that construction cycles down and times that it cycles up. That may not be a good fit for certain types of owners. They may need more stability. And we always, when I'm working with buyers and buyers are telling me they're interested, I make sure that they can answer the question, I want to purchase this business because. And if they can really give a thoughtful response to that question, as a buyer, you're going to be a very attractive candidate to the seller. And it's going to make your offer more than just the numbers on the page. So, what do good buyers know? They know not to submit an LOI. By the way, you'll see me interchangeably using the term offer and letter of intent. Letter of intent is a format for an offer. It's a specific written type of offer. Letter of intent, LOI. Good buyers know you do not submit an LOI if you aren't serious about buying the business. The expectation is the letter of intent arrives, you intend to buy that business, unless, of course, something shows up in due diligence that would cause you to need to back away. You aren't doing the seller a favor. You need to earn the winning bid. We talked about that. Put yourself in the place of a seller for a second. As a buyer, you're coming in, you're kind of cold, you're seeing this business for the first time, but the seller has built an entire lifestyle around this business. I've talked to sellers who have owned businesses for 40 years. And during that time, they've become pillars of the community. They have lots of civic connections. They may serve on boards. Sellers are often highly identified with their business. And if they're going to be giving that up, they're going to be turning over more than just the black and white numbers. They're going to be turning over their lifestyle, their livelihood. And so buyers, you're encouraged to get beyond the numbers. Yes, the numbers are important, but you want to get beyond the numbers to build rapport with that seller. Again, you're looking for the seller to select you over potentially other offers. You're likely not going to be the only one. If, as a buyer, you come in and the business, to use a number, is priced at $1 million, and you say, I'm going to offer $800,000, as a buyer, you should be prepared to say why you're offering $800,000. It's important for the seller to understand why you view their business as being worth less money than they and the broker who's probably helped them price the business believe that it's worth. It's a point of discussion, and it's important to be able to answer that question. Also, buyers, this is a time for patience when offers are submitted. This is not a time to rush. sellers are going to need time to review and compare the offers they're getting. We say that the offers inform the seller of what the market really is for their business. And we priced the business at $1 million, and maybe somebody did offer 800. Somebody else maybe offered 900. Somebody else might have offered $1,050,000 because they believe that the business is worth more. And so sellers need time to do this. So buyers, it's really a poor tactic to say you have 24 hours to accept my offer or I'm pulling out. You just need some patience as you put this together. And buyers who've been through this process before, and oftentimes buyers have made offers on multiple businesses that they didn't close on for whatever reason, they understand. First-time buyers may not understand, and they may think it's something that they can leverage their offer to get it considered more strongly, but it doesn't work that way. And we use this saying on the last line here frequently. Deals move at the speed of trust. We have to establish trust between the buyer, the seller, and the broker. There has to be a real recognition that the transaction is only going to happen if everything is above board, everybody is candid, everybody is prepared to represent their interests, and their interests may be different, but in a very positive and trustful way. So just saying, you can't do this at arm's length. Buying a business is not like buying a home or a commercial building where there is no necessary rapport between buyer and seller. There absolutely is with a business. Okay, let's talk about the basics of offers, letter of intent, offers. So an offer really is setting expectations on both sides, buyer and seller side, because there's going to be a negotiation and there's going to be a need to get these things worked out so that both people know, what's really on the table here. I'm very comfortable as a broker. I'm very comfortable with a potential buyer saying, hey, I'm not ready to give a letter of intent, but here is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking I'll pay this price. I'm thinking I'd like to have a seller note, which is a loan from the seller to help buy the business of, let's say, 10% of the selling price. I'm going to bring 10% of the selling price from my own funds, and the rest is going to come from an SBA lender. Okay, that gives me a chance to say to that buyer, you know what? It sounds pretty good, but I've got a seller who doesn't prefer a seller note, would not like to have that. Would you want to go back and think about maybe putting an offer together without a seller note? Or, your price is quite a bit lower than what the sellers are looking for. You can offer whatever you want. It's your offer. I'm just letting you know, based on my knowledge of the seller, that offer may not go anywhere. So sometimes getting an informal float of the price and the key terms is a good way to get the ball rolling. However, a formal letter of intent, and we'll talk about what goes into that is going to come written up with much more specific detail. It's submitted by the buyer. It's their offer to the seller to purchase the business. Brokers are often involved. And the reason brokers are involved is to help the buyer craft an offer that the buyer supports, but that the seller can understand and covers the important business terms that we're going to talk about. A couple things about letter of intent. Letter of intent is a non-binding agreement. That means that the buyer or the seller can back out, no penalty, can back out. It isn't until you get to the purchase agreement that you're locking people in. So it's non-binding, which is why you typically don't need attorneys to help put them together, because it doesn't have to be written with the same specificity that a contract is written, with all the representations and, you know, those kinds of things. It's just a framework for the deal structure. But it is important to avoid loose ends. You don't want things that crop up later in the purchase agreement that you're going to have disputes over, when they could have been put into the letter of intent to begin with, and everybody would be in agreement about what those are. So it's important to avoid loose ends. And attorneys not involved are necessary, again, because it's not a legal document. Let's talk about the elements of a letter of intent. So number one thing is the total dollar amount to be paid for the business. And I'm simply going to use $1 million as a placeholder. So I will purchase your business for $1 million. The other thing you need to specify is whether you're purchasing this as an asset acquisition or a stock purchase or a membership interest purchase. So an asset acquisition means you're getting all of the operating assets of the business, tangible and intangible assets, but you're not getting the liabilities. You're not getting accounts payable. You're not getting the taxes that might be due on the business. In a stock purchase, you're taking over everything. You're going to take over those liabilities. A stock purchase is very rare. We're going to stay with asset acquisition today because 98% of the small businesses that are sold are an asset acquisition. A membership interest and that's typically if it was an S corp, which is what a lot of businesses are, asset acquisition. Membership interest is if the company's an LLC, but it's in many ways exactly the same as an asset acquisition. It's just a membership interest purchase. Okay. Baseline business terms. In addition to the price and in addition to the type of purchase you're doing, there's a few things that you're going to want to know. So a lot of businesses have inventory. A retail store has inventory. And so I'm going to admit one more person just showed up. So that included inventory needs to be stated. $1 million price. We might say this sale price of $1 million will include $200,000 in inventory. So the buyer knows that they are receiving $200,000. Now, when you get down to the closing, there might be $150,000 or there might be $250,000 of actual inventory in the store. Some stores are very seasonal. They have much larger inventories at one time of year than another. There's usually a provision in there that says if there's less than $200,000, the price will be discounted because you're getting less inventory by that same amount. If there's greater than $200,000, the purchaser will buy that additional inventory from the seller. So there's a term about the included inventory. There's a term about included working capital. So this is not all that common, but it sometimes happens that the seller leaves $100,000 and gives that to the buyer. Now, usually when we see it, what we see happen is purchase price is $1 million. Buyer wants $100,000 in working capital. Typically what happens is the purchase price goes up to $1,100,000 to offset the $100,000 that's included. So we see those kinds of adjustments being made. There's a category called work in progress or WIP. Imagine that you manufacture, let's say cars and let's say golf carts. And, you know, on the production line, there are golf carts that are in production. They have been partially built. The seller has incurred costs to get those golf carts partially built. The buyer will take over building the rest of those golf carts and will incur the cost. So when there is work in progress, there usually is a concession to the seller for the amount of work that has been concluded that buyers will be taking over. That's a business term that belongs in a letter of intent. You don't want to leave that out and wait until you get to the purchase agreement to find out that you disagree on what you're going to do with work in progress. Get it done up front. There are also escrows. Escrows is where some of the seller proceeds are set aside against the possibility of some losses or liabilities that the buyer might incur that were really generated by the seller. So an example of that might be there's a recognition that there are a couple key customers, and the seller has made the representation that I guarantee you those customers are going to stay with us. They love us, and they account for $200,000 in revenue. And as soon as the customers find out that the business has been sold, they transfer their business to somebody else. And though that revenue and those profits don't come. Well, if you have identified up front the possibility that there's going to be some escrows against customer retention or taxes that need to be paid, etc., it's common, and you can put in there, we're going to ask that this amount of money be set aside. And then there's what's called earnouts and earndowns. So an earnout is, I'll pay you $1 million for your business, and I'll give you an extra $200,000 if the business increases by 5% a year over the next 3 years. That's an earn out where the buyer pays more for the business because it's met some performance criteria. Something to know is if you're getting an SBA loan to purchase a business, you can't have an earnout. SBA will not approve that. So just to be aware. An earn down is in essence the opposite of an earn out. And it is a lowering of the price if over a set of months or years following the closing, certain performance criteria are not met, then the price is actually reduced. Again, that money could come out of an escrow, or oftentimes we see it combined with a seller note where certain portions of the seller note will not need to be paid off. So if there are going to be any kind of earn out or earn down, it's important to get those into the letter of intent. Okay, earnest money. Earnest money should be in the letter of intent. How much cash am I going to, in essence, pay you to accept my offer? That's cash that will go against the future purchase, but it will be held in escrow to the benefit of the seller unless the letter of intent is terminated. So what's the point of earnest money? One is it demonstrates that the buyer has the ability to access capital. So it's not a huge number, but let's say it's 1% of $1 million price. That's $10,000. Can you get $10,000 and put it in escrow at the time of making the offer? That's a statement that you have access to some capital. It's also proof of your interest. Hey, I just want you to know I'm so genuinely interested in purchasing this business. I'm willing to take some money and go stick it in typically a non-interest bearing escrow account. Keep in mind, earnest money is fully refundable if the deal is canceled. Sellers do not expect to retain earnest money. It almost never happens. Buyers will get the money back. So it's fully refundable. And sellers, if you decide that you want to terminate the offer, things aren't going well, you're not comfortable with the sale for whatever reason, then if you terminate, again, the buyer gets the earnest money back. Even if you felt like the buyer was operating in bad faith or there was something, they are going to get their earnest money back. Just be aware of that. Don't spend the money. Don't think you're going to be spending the money. Okay. So let's look at what our offer is so far. We've said that it's going to be $1 million price. We've said that it's an asset sale. We've said that it includes, I said 200,000 earlier, we're going to call it 100,000 here. Includes 100,000 in inventory. There is no working capital being transferred. This particular business doesn't have any work in progress, like we were talking with the golf carts. But we are going to ask for 75,000 for customer retention for 1 year and an additional 25,000 until proof that all taxes have been paid. We're not going to have an earn out or an earn down, and we're going to have $10,000 in earnest money. So that's what this letter of intent has included so far. All very important for the seller to be able to say, what is this buyer bringing to the table? Now we know what that buyer is bringing to the table. Let's look at some more things that a letter of intent should include. How is the purchase going to be paid for? So there's going to be a buyer equity injection. That's their cash, their down payment, the amount of money. There's only 3 sources of funds for any business transaction. One of them is what the buyer brings to the table. One is what the SBA commercial lender brings to the table. And one would be a seller promissory note, if indeed there is one. That's it. Now, that buyer equity injection could come from savings. It could come from liquidating an IRA. It could come from using what's called the Hobbs, which is where you use your IRA as a funding mechanism. You don't take the money out, but you use it as an investment funding mechanism. You know, it could come from any number of places, but it's still buyer's money coming to the table. What do we commonly see? We commonly see a minimum of 10%. We usually don't see more than 20%, but we have seen 30%. Why is it not bigger than that? The answer is buyers want to purchase the most expensive business that they can purchase. They want to purchase the most profitability that they can purchase. So they're looking to leverage whatever funds they can bring to the maximum, rather than take cash, spend it, and you've lost your leverage on that money. So that's why we usually see 10%, 15%, 20%. Now, that's going to be impacted by what the SBA lender is going to do. It's going to be impacted by whether or not there's a seller promissory note. Commercial lenders are going to loan 70 to 80%. When the commercial lenders, SBA lenders, get aggressive, we start to see them offering 85% financing, 90% financing. It just, that market changes, and it changes month to month, year to year. So it moves around, but you will almost always be able to get 70%, often 80%, sometimes higher, of the funds to purchase the business coming from the SBA commercial lender. And then the promissory note, if the seller is willing to give one, and if it is a traditional sale of a strong business with measurable profits, then you'll see a seller note, 0 if there isn't one, 5, 10, 15%, maybe as high as 20. Some sellers like seller notes because they're going to be able to defer their taxes on that into a subsequent year. Some sellers don't like promissory notes. They just want to be done. So different sellers have different approaches on that. Lenders can actually require a seller note. So that's an important thing. Let's see. couple questions in chat here.
Yep, perfect.
So I'm going to go ask those. If a business is listed back after an LOI, can the buyer request the real reasons for the deal not going through? If a business is listed back after an LOI, can the buyer request? Sure, the buyer can request it. We talked about deals move at the speed of trust. I would think giving the buyer the actual reason that it didn't go forward is very legitimate. That would be my opinion. That's not a legal requirement, but I think it's just something that's important to consider. And then, is there a required minimum balance for using IRA funds without withdrawing? So I'm not an IRA specialist. There is a program called a ROBS, ROBS. And what a ROBS does is you use the funds in your IRA. The purchase has after the business is purchased, it must be set up as a C corporation, not an S corporation, because a ROBS can only take IRA funds and redirect them to invest in a C corporation. There is no limit to my knowledge on what that is. There are a number of firms that will, for a fee, manage the transfer of your IRA funds into a ROB and the purchase. I'll give you the name of one. It's Guidant, Guidant, and you can talk to the people at Guidant, and they can answer very, very specific questions about using your IRA for okay. Here's another item. Hopefully that answered your question. Let me know if not. Here's another item that's super important. What's your transaction timeline? We talked about buyers needing time to weigh the offers, time to negotiate, refine the LOI. We usually find that it can take 2, 3, 4 weeks after offers start rolling in before they actually get signed. Remember, that seller is only going to sign one LOI. Even though they may have received 3 or 4 or more, they're only going to sign one. That's the buyer they want to work with. So they need time to sort through who these buyers are, what the deals are, so that the one person gets that. It should specify when you want to sign the upcoming purchase agreement. 30 to 45 days is a common amount of time because you're going to need to get attorneys involved. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. Hopefully the letter of intent has been accurate, has been thorough, has been complete, so you don't have a lot of loose ends with the purchase agreement, but you still need to make sure everything's done. And then due diligence completion. We usually say due diligence should be completed at the same time that you're going to enter into the purchase agreement. And when will the closing be? Why are these important? Well, one person might say, well, I want my kids to finish up their school year and they're not out of school for 6 more months. So I don't want to buy this for 7 or 8 months. Another buyer might say, I'm ready to close in 3 months. Depending on what the seller's needs are, there may be a difference in how they evaluate those timelines. That's why it's important for buyers to indicate what their timeline is going to be. Transition and training, another important thing. If you have a buyer who owns 3 hardware stores already and is getting ready to buy a 4th hardware store, that buyer is not going to need a lot of transition support or training, just some basic things about what's going on with that business. But if that buyer is moving into the first time they've ever owned that type of business, they might need a significant amount of training. And so it's important for the seller to understand what the buyer's going to be asking for. Are they going to be looking for weeks? Or are they going to want that seller to be around for months or a year? You know, are they going to be able to do that training on premise or remote? If a business is highly seasonal and you're buying it down in the low season, are you going to be prepared to operate that highly seasonal business? Or are you going to need the seller to come back in and get involved in helping you understand the mechanics of that business when it's operating at a completely different level than it was at the low schedule? I do have experience. I see buyers usually ask for more than they need. It makes the sellers a little bit uncomfortable when they ask for 300 hours of support when they might only need 40. And so, you know, think through what you're really looking to get done during a transition and training. Are you just going to want to know how the point of sale system works? Or are you going to want to know how to deal with your international suppliers of goods? Two very different things. And so it's important to recognize what you are looking to get help with, as well as how much you need. And a lot of times it gets ratcheted up or down. This is one of the things that does change between letter of intent and purchase agreement, is the amount of training support because of what's learned during the due diligence process. Okay, here's another one. Talked a little bit about this, talked about leverage, talked about putting pressure on the sellers to accept deals. Here's another place that I'm pretty sure buyers get this language because they go to the internet and they see this language, and so they stick it in. If the seller takes this offer, we want total exclusivity. We don't want the seller ever talking to any other buyers. We want the business taken off the market. We want to have the rights to do everything. Well, I got to tell you, buyers, you haven't earned it yet, because you have a deal that you can walk away from just by saying, I've decided I don't want this business anymore. Why should a seller support your exclusivity request, especially for 30 or 60 or 90 days to take the business off of the market when you can walk away? It just doesn't make sense. And so as a broker, I would come back strongly with the seller and say, no, we want to give the buyer that we've chosen the exclusive opportunity to make the transaction happen. But we are not going to take the business off the market. We are going to continue to talk to other buyers. Deals move at the speed of trust. We will put in language that says, buyer, we are giving you every chance. We will not accept any other offers. But we're not going to stop talking to people until there's a purchase agreement. So just letting you know, buyers, you should expect to get serious pushback on any attempt to lock down a business like that. It's just not fair to the sellers. It's very disruptive should you not go forward with it. It's almost like they have to start all over again listing their business, and they do not want to do that. They just want to be able to call the next person in line and say, hey, looks like this deal's not going to happen. You back in? And that's reasonable. That's fair. Okay, due diligence. So it's important to indicate what you want for due diligence. I tell buyers, what you're looking for are material things that will cause you to back away from buying this business. Finding out that the profit and loss statements have been totally misrepresented. That's a material factor. Finding out that everybody on the staff is going to quit the day the business closes. That's a material factor, right? Those are things that are important. But it's not just an open-ended, hi, I got this list off the internet. These are the 412 things I need you to produce in the next 2 weeks. That drives everybody crazy. So it's important to identify what could lead to termination of the transaction. Better way to put that is, it's important to understand what you need to see to continue moving forward with the transaction. You're looking for proof that everything is as represented. You're not looking for proof that something isn't as represented. You want to buy the business, remember? It's also not the time to learn how to operate the business. This is not a training period. This is a period to learn how to, whether you want to buy it, whether you're going to enter into a purchase agreement. And there needs to be a reasonable time. We say 30 to 45 days. And it's also, flip this around, it's the seller making sure that the buyer is fully capable of getting the deal done and operating the business. So there are going to be requests of the buyer as well as requests of the seller. So that's really what due diligence is all about. Certain contingencies always go in a letter of intent. They'll also frequently go in the purchase agreement. Obviously, the deal's contingent on getting lender financing. As a seller, we're going to ask the buyer who's financing your deal. We want to talk to that lender. We will not accept an offer without talking to your lender. But talking to your lender and getting their statement that they fully intend to finance you is not the same thing as financing. Financing only happens at closing. So the deal is always contingent on getting lender financing. The deal is always contingent on getting landlord approval and a suitable lease. Obviously, you can't buy a business if you're not going to have a place to operate. So we're going to need to get with a landlord, and there's probably a contingency in the letter of intent because we haven't gotten with the landlord yet, but we will be. You have to be able to get licenses to operate the business, trade licenses, liquor licenses, whatever might be involved. If for any reason you can't get a license, you can't buy the business. Sometimes there are suppliers or franchisors who are going to need to approve you as a buyer. I use the example of a bike store. If you're a bike store and you're a Trek dealer, you can't buy the business if you don't have approval from Trek to take over the bike store. If they're not going to sell you bikes, you don't have a business. So these are things that get put into a letter of intent that's a contingency. And, I just got it. Okay, I thought maybe I had a question, but I don't, so that's good. And then there's some other things that could be, those are non-optional contingencies. They're just always in there. Here's some that are optional. You might put in there, you're expecting key employee retention. You might put in there, you're expecting a non-compete from the seller. Non-competes are typically made up of three things: a duration or time period, let's say 3 years, a location within 25 miles of Fort Collins, and an activity, a bike store or a Mexican restaurant or something, right? So that's what a non-compete would exclude a seller from getting involved in. You're going to want to say you have the satisfaction, validation of books and records, and you're going to want to put a contingency in there that says there's no material change in the business between the time this offer goes in and when we close or enter the purchase agreement. So all those things, contingencies, they should show up. So I think, let's just go through it one more time. $1 million price, asset sale, 100,000 in inventory, no working capital, no work in progress, a couple of escrows, no earn out or earn down, 10,000 earnest money. Buyer's going to put in $200,000 in equity, 725,000 in an SBA loan, $75,000 seller note for 5 years at 7%. The LOI is going to be signed within 10 days, just to make up something. Purchase agreement in 45 days following LOI, closing 60 days following the purchase agreement. That's that timeline. 40 hours of on-site training, first 20 days after closing, then some remote training. And that language we talked about, that the seller will not sign any other LOIs prior to the purchase agreement target date, but will be talking to buyers. That's language that I support. As buyers, you may not want to have that language, but if you don't have something that the seller can agree to, the offer won't be accepted. So you're going to need to find a meeting of the minds to make that happen. Final deal points. There's a due diligence period. There's going to be a landlord meeting. There's going to be lender selection and commitment, contingencies, obviously getting the $725,000 in SBA financing, getting that new lease, your satisfaction, no material change in the business, and a non-compete of 3 years, 25 miles in the same business or industry category. That is what a letter of intent looks like. Good sellers know. We had what good buyers know early on. Let's talk about what good sellers know. They know that all offers and buyers are going to have strengths and weaknesses. They have to understand what's most important to them as a seller. Is it getting this done quickly? Is it maximizing the price? Is it being able to walk away cleanly at the end? Is it having your employees taken care of into the future? Is it a seller note, either having one or not having one? Is it the personal connection you want to make with the buyer? What is it, seller, that's going to cause you to really look at an offer and feel like you're prepared to go down the road with this buyer? Good sellers also know everything is a negotiation. Buyers have to compromise, sellers have to compromise. You can't dig your heels in and say my way or the highway. You really need to be prepared for the fact that buyers in the market might see your business different than you do. And if you want to make a sale, which is why you got into this in the beginning, you need to be prepared to hear what the market is saying and compromise. Be flexible. Sellers, only one LOI. Never, ever, ever enter into an LOI with more than one person. What are you going to do when it's time to actually choose? You're going to tell a buyer, I was just kidding, I've got another buyer. You never want to do that. So up front, you pick the buyer, you make that choice, you let the other people know that they were not selected. That's where a broker can be very helpful. They probably established quite a bit of rapport with all of the buyers who've shown interest. They can convey to these buyers that they're not going to get the deal. And again, deals move at the speed of trust. Everything needs to be above board and handled. Wow. That's the letter of intent. I'm just doing a quick time check here. We're going to want to move pretty quickly. Interestingly enough, letter of intent is sometimes a more complicated stage than contracts or closing. So I'm going to move through these a little bit more quickly. Keep in mind, LOI was the non-binding intention to purchase. Purchase agreement is the binding contract. Asset purchase agreement's the most common. We use APA for asset purchase agreement. We'll use that today. Legally abiding. I use the example. Elon Musk tried to get out of his purchase agreement of Twitter. Court said he can't. He had to buy it. It's a legally binding agreement. When you enter into that, it means this deal is going through unless there's something proven. Attorneys are always involved. Attorneys are important. Make sure you have an attorney with experience in doing purchase agreements. We say it's the playbook. It's the rules of engagement for the transaction. Everything that's in there is very specific, and it's how the transaction is going to happen by the time you get to closing. It tends to be about 10 to 30 pages long. Plus, there can be a lot of exhibits like furniture, fixtures, and equipment that's included, intangible assets, other things. So prior to entering into an APA, what does the buyer need to do? Needs to make sure their lender and loan commitment is rock solid. Needs to make sure that they're going to be able to get either an assignment or a new lease with the landlord. Has to put together their own business entity, take possession of this, create their own S Corp or LLC or whatever they're making. And they have to resolve any other contingencies that were in that letter of intent. Good buyers know. Important. When you move from LOI to purchase agreement, you don't change price. unless there are material issues. You agreed to a price, stick with the price. Changing the price is just a guarantee that that deal is going to fall apart. There's an expectation of certainty. We said with the LOI, there was an expectation you're going to the finish line. When you go to a purchase agreement, there's certainty. Most of your due diligence should be done. Most of your advanced preparatory tasks should be done. Have I said this before? I'm going to say it again. Deals move at the speed of trust. Question for SBDC. If there are any attorneys with the SBDC that they can consult with. And I am certain there are. I just don't know who they are, so I'm going to leave that to SBDC to answer that question. Okay. Common revisions, what might change? Might change the earnest money, might make it non-refundable. Contingencies are going to come down. Some of the contingencies in the LOI may be dealt with, they may be finished, so they don't need to continue as contingencies in the purchase agreement. Proof of the lender. We might use a verbal statement from the lender to accept an LOI, but we may want a written statement from the lender of how they're going to finance this deal. We may need to close the timeline for the practical realities of just getting the deal done. Exclusivity with a purchase agreement, yes, it does make sense to take the business off the market because there's a 99.99% chance that with a signed purchase agreement, there's going to be a close. Transition support can be modified, exhibits added. Things that need to be in the contract, financial adjustments and settlements. So for example, you've got a business. Let's say you're a wedding venue and you have taken large customer deposits. Well, those customer deposits are going to get transferred to the buyer because it's the buyer who needs to provide the services for that wedding at that venue. And so you're going to transfer those things. Seller is going to keep the cash on hand. They might have $300,000 in their bank account. That's the seller's $300,000. That's not the buyer's $300,000. That's going to be provided for. Receipt of accounts receivable. Some businesses have accounts receivable. They might be coming in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days after the closing. If those goods and services have been delivered, those accounts receivable go to the seller, not to the buyer, because the seller incurred the cost of delivering those goods and services. Reverse is true on accounts payable. There may be accounts payable that are due following the closing. Those are going to be the responsibility of the seller, or oftentimes they're just accelerated to all be paid off by the time of closing. Seller deposits. Seller might have a deposit in on lease on the business or something with the utilities company. Those get transferred either to the buyer, and the buyer adds that money to the seller, what they're paying, or the seller gets them back from whoever's holding the deposit, and the buyer does their prorations on rent. Let's say you have a $10,000 a month rent. You close on the 15th. Rents are paid in advance. The seller gets 50% of that $10,000 benefit while they own the business. The buyer gets $5,000 benefit when they own the business. So the buyer has to give the seller $5,000. So that's a proration because that's prepaid rent. Same thing can happen with advertising and other things. You need to be specific about what assets are transferred. Tangible assets are vehicles, equipment, fixtures, leasehold improvements, supplies, inventory. Those are all assets that the buyer is acquiring. And you want to list all of those things. Intangible assets, trade names, websites, domain names, social media accounts, customer lists. All of those are intangible assets. They're not physical items. They're intellectual property. And they're what help the business succeed. So they're intangible assets. And if there's anything that's not happening, boy, the most common is that small business owners often have their personal cars under the business name. Those personal cars are not going to transfer to the new buyer, so they're going to be excluded. You also are going to want to talk about the allocation of price. We talked about the business is selling for $1 million. Total price is always broken into defined IRS categories. And by the way, sometimes it can be good to put this allocation of price up front in the letter of intent, just so everybody knows how that's going to happen. But we've talked about inventory. We've said $100,000 is going to be there. You need to talk about how that's going to be valued. Inventory has to be marketable, right? It can't be a bunch of old stock sitting in the warehouse somewhere that was paid $25,000 for it, but nobody wants to buy it. So that's going to be discounted to zero. So we're talking about the marketable inventory. How are you going to do that? Are you going to do a count? Are you going to do the count after closing? Are you just going to make estimates? Are you going to work off of invoices from the point of sale system or information there? So tangible assets, what's allocated to this? What's allocated to personal property? Land and buildings are, if you're actually selling property, we're not going to get into that right now. Intangible assets, intellectual property, non-competes, trainings, franchise rights, business trade name, goodwill. Here's the reason an allocation of price is important. There are different taxation levels for everything that is allocated in that $1 million price. Inventory is not taxed. Goodwill is taxed as long-term capital gains. Tangible assets, furniture, fixtures, and equipment are taxed at earned income rates for all value of furniture, fixture, and equipment that's greater than the depreciated value on the balance sheet. That's the highest taxation rate. It's important for sellers to know what they're going to be taxed at. It's important for buyers to know how much of that is going to be able to go on the balance sheet. And then both parties, buyers and sellers, are going to file this form called an IRS 8594. That's the form that says what the allocation of the purchase price is, and they have to be identical. If they are not identical, the IRS system will find that, and it will trigger an audit, and nobody wants an audit. So it's really important that is done properly. So here we go. $1 million total price, $100,000 in inventory, $100,000 in FFE, $5,000 non-compete, $5,000 for training, $790,000 is in goodwill. That's the allocation of the price. And so it's going to be different for every transaction, but that's what this one is. You need to specify that. And it can be negotiable. Work in progress. Since there was none, we're not going to talk about it because we want to move on. But I want now to talk about tax obligations. Keep in mind, any tax liability is going to transfer to the new owners of the business. So that's why we talked about having that escrow up front, just in case something with the tax liability doesn't get covered. That's a way to protect the buyer. Even though the seller is responsible for them, if something slips through the cracks or there's some kind of problem, it's nice for the buyer to be protected. And payment for taxes often in arrears. So there needs, just like rent is in advance, so you need a settlement value, which tends to work the opposite way. A lot of businesses are going to have debts. They're going to need to be retired and paid off out of proceeds. The buyer is not going to assume those liabilities or those debts. They're getting a clean transaction. We could probably retire this last line, PPP loans. It's declining as an issue. Almost everyone got forgiveness. There's very few outstanding PPP loans anymore, but there was a time we need to worry about those, but not any longer. Okay. In a purchase agreement, how are we going to talk about employees? Well, we're going to talk, first question is, Are there any employees that need to be terminated by a seller? You know, it's not really fair if you as a seller understand that there's employees that really should be terminated. It is not fair to put that burden on the buyer just coming into the business. Talk about a way for a buyer to start off with a sour relationship with the employees is to take actions like that. So in the event there are employees that need to be let go for whatever reason, maybe the business is shrinking a little, maybe you've had a problem with an employee. Sellers, that's really your responsibility. You need to take that on. Should there be a key employee retention plan? It is not uncommon for a buyer coming in, work with the seller and say, look, I really need these employees at least for the first 6 months. I'd like to put together a retention plan. Seller, you've indicated to me that these employees aren't going to quit. Would you fund a little bonus structure? You fund part of it, I'll fund part of it, and that'll help us keep these employees on. Working something like that. How are employees going to be notified? The most common way to notify employees is to have a meeting about 1 hour after closing and say, you had a new owner. You have a new owner, right? And a lot of times that's because sellers don't want to notify their employees up front. They're worried about disruption to the business. And buyers, you need to understand that sellers are really, really sensitive to that. You probably would like for them to know earlier than that, but it frequently does not happen. Again, goes to the flexibility and compromise on both sides to understand that maybe your interests are a little different. Got to work out the payroll transition plan. Is it coming in with a new payroll system, just taking over the existing one? Employee raises prior to closing. Buyers are not going to want to be saddled with employees getting raises prior to closing that they're then going to have to pay, which is going to cut into their profitability. So sellers and buyers need to get together on that and make sure that there's nothing unexpected happening. Accrued employee benefits, vacation plans, retirement accounts, bonus plans, all of those need to be disclosed and planned for. And what are the employee policies? You're going to want to know, is the employee policy unlimited vacation? We're starting to see that in new tech industry businesses. Is it 1 week of paid vacation for each year up to 3 weeks after the first, whatever it is, the buyer is probably going to want to retain current policies because they're not looking to disrupt. So they just need to know what all of those are. Possession. Possession is when they're taking it over. That usually is the closing date, the keys transfer, and the possession usually transfers at midnight, the morning before closing or the morning of closing. And it's actually the buyer's business all that day, even though they haven't done the paperwork. So that's the most common way to do it. Representations and warranties are always part of this. Representations and warranties, good standing, authority to act, ownership, involved brokers and fees. These are all just boilerplate kind of language. If you have an attorney working with you on this, they're going to know all these things. I don't really need to go through them today, but you need to know that these are all part of a contract, and you're going to be dependent on your attorneys to get these right. Here's some more boilerplate: termination, indemnification, conduct of business. All of these are boilerplate items. Entire agreement, noticing, governing law. Where does is there going to be any kind of arbitration, fees and expenses? What gets paid for? All these things are going to need to be in this document. And then you get a contract. And like I said, that is the document that most defines the rules. And you go on to closing from there. Let's see. Okay, I was looking at the chat just to make sure that was some information about the attorney, which is great. Okay, what's the closing? That's the legal transfer of the business from seller to buyer. It's a highly detailed process. There is no participant in this transaction who is more important to its success than a highly competent and experienced closing attorney. Somebody who specializes in the business of, as a neutral party, representing everything that has to happen from the buyer side, everything that has to happen from the seller side, all of the paperwork that needs to be signed, all of the filings that have to happen with the Secretary of State, all of the money that has to be received in, all of the money that has to be paid out. It's just the place where everything can get messed up if you don't have a competent closing attorney. Now, as a broker, I'm really comfortable that that closing attorney can be either the buyer's attorney or seller's attorney as well, but they're entering into a separate engagement with the buyer and seller as a neutral party. And you want to make sure you're getting an engagement agreement that specifies that they are a neutral party and that they're not serving as an advocate for one or the other. Typically, the buyer and seller will agree on who that closing attorney is. They will typically split costs. How much is a closing attorney? Typically anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 split between the parties is what we see. The best money you will ever spend. Get a closing attorney. What kinds of things will they do? They'll look to make sure there aren't any liens on the business. They'll make sure if there are any payoffs for loans, they get those statements from the lenders. They'll check status and amounts of personal property tax that's due so they can prorate that. They will validate that the seller and buyer entities are legal entities, that they're able to enter into this agreement. They'll coordinate with the SBA lender and the seller note to get the money in and to make sure that the language in the contract, in the purchase agreement, so on and so forth, reflects what these lenders need. They'll receive all the funds and they'll disperse all the funds and they'll prepare the closing documents. What are the closing documents? There's a sheet called the closing instructions. It says everything that's going to happen. There are settlement statements. We've talked about these pre and post paid settlements and things that move back and forth. Those will all be included. There will be resolutions from the entities. This S Corp agrees that they have the rights and these officers are signing that they have agreed to buy this business. This corporation has agreed that they're going to sell. All those resolutions. There's a bill of sale for tangible assets, vehicle odometer statements, assignments of the intangible assets. All of these documents come through the closing attorney. Non-competition agreement, seller promissory note and security agreement, the UCC financing statements, deeds of trust. I mean, I don't want to talk about what all of these are. There's so many of them, and it would be hours just to cover what each of them are. But what I really want to make you is aware of how many of these things are there and why a closing attorney is so important. The closing attorney also provides the facility where the closing takes place and the services. So they'll have a notary. They'll provide a copier and scanner, get sets of documents to all the parties. They'll provide secretarial services if they're needed. All of these things to make the closing happen smoothly. And then, of course, they're going to disperse the funds. The money that goes to sellers, the money that goes to payoffs, anything that gets held in escrow, broker commissions, possibly broker referral fees, and their legal fees and other legal fees. Sometimes we see out of the closing proceeds, we see the seller's attorney, not the closing attorney, but the seller's attorney being paid out of the closing proceeds. So they would handle that if that's going to be dispersed. And then post-closing, they're going to do the filings. They're going to file with the Secretary of State. Maybe the entity name changes for the seller, because let's say the seller is selling a business. It's the ABC Company, and they also own ABC Company Inc. And they want the buyer to get the name ABC Company Inc. So they're going to change the name of their entity to the XYZ Inc. And the buyer is going to take possession of ABC Company Inc., not the corporation itself, just the names. Those filings have to be done with the Secretary of State. It's the closing attorney who does it. The seller is going to give up their trade names. The buyer is going to assume the trade names. Those filings have to be done with the Secretary of State. If there are loan payoffs for the seller, there are going to be filings related to that. UCC liens, making sure that there are no liens or that those liens are cleared, and transfer of trade loans. So lots of paperwork that the closing attorney is doing. And then there's a closing, there's a celebration, out comes the champagne. Sellers, you no longer own this business. Buyers, you have a new and exciting future out ahead of you. Everyone should toast. Everyone should celebrate. You've gotten to the finish line. There's nothing really more exciting than the closing. It's the time where everything comes together. Remember that stage one? Gee, do I really want to buy a business? What kind of business? Where do I want to buy it? You maybe looked at 10 businesses. You maybe put an offer in on 3. You got an offer accepted. You negotiated that. You did a purchase agreement. You went through all the due diligence. You got new leases set up. You've done all that. And here you are, buyer. You are the owner of this business. And seller, exit stage right. So what are some of the key takeaways? Number 1, an LOI, as early as it is in the process, even though it's non-binding, it's not a toe in the water. It's not a trial balloon. It's a commitment to purchase. I intend to purchase. It's a letter of intent. But there are contingencies in case things are not as advertised or something can't come together. Sellers, just one LOI. You can have 5 offers in front of you. We've seen that. That's common. But you're going to have to pick one. And when you pick that person, that's the person you want to go all the way to the finish line with. And that should be your expectation from the start. You do not want a deal to fall apart, even in between the LOI and purchase agreement stage. It can happen, but that should not be the expectation. That should not be your target. An LOI is non-binding. So the goal is to move from LOI to purchase agreement as quickly as possible. Yes, there's some due diligence that needs to happen in there. Yes, the attorneys get involved and there needs to be the drafting of a contract and the like. But you want to get there as quickly as possible. We recommend 30 to 45 days if you can do it. The APA, purchase agreement, asset purchase agreement, it's legally binding. It indicates certainty that the deal is moving forward. It's the playbook. The LOI was the kind of the guiding numbers, but the purchase agreement is the playbook. Everything is going to happen according to what's in that contract. There are no loose ends. Both parties use capable attorneys. And I always say this, watch out for the error of omission. That's the error that is hardest to spot, which is why capable attorneys are the most valued. They help you find things that didn't get included and make sure that they are included. Use experienced attorneys, have an agreed upon scope of work with that attorney, get mutual agreement of buyer and seller on the closing attorney. Documents for the closing should be circulated 5 days in advance so that the individual buyer and seller with their attorneys can look them over and make sure there are not going to be any surprises at the closing. You want to ask the closing attorney, tell them that you want those documents to circulate 5 days in advance. That should be part of the scope of work. And remember, if your funds do not arrive to the closing attorney in time, that disbursement of funds can be delayed. The number one place that they don't get in until later is lenders seldom, if ever, will fund their amounts of money until the closing documents are in fact completely signed and conveyed to that lender. They will then release the money. But because of the time delays and wire transfers and the like, it can be 2 to 3 days before those funds can be dispersed by the closing attorney. So the concept of having a check put in your hand at closing for sellers, it's just not going to happen like that. It's usually several days later. So we have gone through offers, contracts, and closing. We've answered a few questions along the way. I'm happy to answer some more questions. You're welcome to contact me at any time. You can reach me through Front Range Business Inc. But we really, really thank you for showing up and being a part of our program today. Anything you'd like to add from Larimer SBDC?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. As a reminder, this was recorded, so I'll be sending that out to everyone along with some links, more information, and the presentation. So yeah, like Don said, reach out if you have any questions.
Spencer, I thank you for your nice compliment. Appreciate it. Glad to have you around. I hope you learned something.
Plenty
Yeah,
of things.
thank you, everyone.
You bet. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. We finished 5 minutes early, so I don't know what you're going to do with those 5 minutes, but I hope you enjoy them.